This gentleman came to us several years ago. He is brilliant. He is a tremendous speaker. He will hold your attention. He's extremely entertaining. We are so grateful to have Dr. Wile with us. When he came, we just realized instantaneously what a great, great man and teacher he was. Tonight, Dr. J. Wile is going to talk to us why this scientist believes in a young Earth. That is something that is desperately needed for us to hear tonight. So you can be seated, and Dr. J. Wile, please bless us with the truth. Amen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here again every year. Wonderful to be here. Before I go into the talk, our dear sister did mention it, but we do have to remember today was a very important day 20 years ago. I was flying internationally and got grounded in San Juan for 4 days and in Dallas for a day because of what happened on 9/11. But the real personal thing was my daughter knew that we were coming home on an American Airlines flight out of Dallas. What she heard on the news was there was an American Airlines flight out of Dulles that crashed into the Pentagon. She thought that was our plane. And it took almost an hour of us constantly calling before we could get through because all the phone lines in San Juan were just packed. And so for about an hour, she really thought we were dead. And so when she answered the phone and I said, "Hi, sweetie," she broke down. And I thought to myself later, she was very happy that we weren't, dead. But nearly 3,000 other people, they learned that their family member did die. That's just incredible. So anyway, we can't forget that. We simply can't. Okay. So when it comes to the age of the Earth and young Earth, old Earth, let me start with a small confession. Ever since graduate school, I have been very skeptical of the idea that the Earth is ancient. By the time I went to college, I was a Christian, but I was more than happy to believe that the Earth was billions of years old, like all my teachers told me, because they're smart, I'm not, so therefore, they must be right. But as I started learning more and more science, I started questioning this whole idea, and one reason was because as a chemist, as Dr. Ames will tell you, one thing we have to really, really be careful of is we have to make sure that whatever we state scientifically can be supported by the data. And oftentimes we go a little too far, a little more than the data allow. And let me give you an illustration of what I mean. Let's suppose I have two hydrogen atoms and I put them kind of close together and I measure the energy between them. Now don't worry about why I do this. Just realize chemists do crazy things. And one crazy thing we do is we stuff atoms together and we measure the energy between them, right? So I take these two atoms and I move them a little closer, I measure the energy, I move them a little closer, I measure the energy. I got 3 data points there that all say the energy is essentially 0. So if I was kind of a lazy scientist, I could say, well, no matter how close those atoms get together, the energy will always be 0. But maybe I want to be a little more careful. So I'll say, okay, 3 data points aren't a lot of data points, so let's start moving these atoms even closer together. When I do that, I suddenly see that the energy starts going down as they get closer and closer together. And so now I've got lots of data points. I can't even tell you how many I got there. Lots and lots of data points. It's really clear what's happening now, right? We now know that the energy is just getting lower and lower the closer these atoms get. So let's just say, no matter, if I keep shoving them to closer and closer and closer together, the energy is just going to go down, 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 right? That's a completely valid conclusion based on the data, right? Problem is, if we actually do the rest of the experiment and measure the energy, we find out that's not true either. Because once they get really close together, they start to repel. And then the energy goes sky high. And it turns out the way these two hydrogen atoms make a hydrogen molecule is they get close enough so that the energy is at its lowest value. And that's where those two atoms decide to sit together to make a hydrogen atom, or to make a hydrogen molecule. Now, my point is, if I had stopped there, I would have made the wrong conclusion, right? I had lots of data to back me up. But nevertheless, I made the wrong conclusion. Why? Because I did something irresponsible. I made what's called an irresponsible extrapolation. I took a few data points, figured out a pattern, and said that pattern must go on forever. Now, extrapolation can be very useful in science, because sometimes there are things we can't measure. So we measure as much as we can, and then we extrapolate the rest of the way. But a careful scientist always makes sure that the range over which we're extrapolating is small compared to the range of data we have. So if I've got this much data, I can extrapolate maybe much farther. But if I have this much data, I can't extrapolate this much farther. The thing is, if you want to believe in an ancient Earth, that's exactly what you have to do. We've been measuring most of the things that scientists use to conclude the Earth is ancient for maybe 100 years. And we have to now extrapolate those things over billions of years. That's exactly the opposite of what a careful scientist should do. And when I took analytical chemistry in college, I started thinking this doesn't add up. Because in analytical chemistry, I'm told extrapolation ranges have to be small. But in fact, to get to an ancient Earth, you have to make your extrapolation range ridiculously long. So even though I didn't know a lot of the science, I started really being skeptical of an ancient Earth because responsible scientists shouldn't make that kind of extrapolation. And to this day, I'm always flabbergasted over people who think, scientists, who think we know the Earth is ancient, who think we have all this science to back up the Earth is ancient, because in fact, the very things we need to do to think that the Earth is ancient is bad science. And so I've always been skeptical of it. So after a while, after I had some time to actually start doing some research, and after I actually started working with people who do radioactive dating, I started really questioning this idea that the Earth is really old. But nevertheless, we want to try and figure out something about the age of the Earth. So when I look at how the data we use to try and figure out the age of the Earth, I find that the most reliable data indicate the Earth is pretty young. So for example, one of the most reliable ways we can date something is called dendrochronology. That's the $20 word for counting tree rings, right? Cut a tree, look at its rings, tree forms a ring every year, you count the rings, you know how old the tree is. Turns out you don't actually have to cut the tree down to do this. Trees are ridiculously incredible organisms. They're not like people. I can drill a hole straight through a tree. And as long as I plug up both ends, the tree's going to survive. You know, you can do that maybe here on a human, but you certainly can't do it here. You can put that hole straight through the middle of the tree, no problem. So we can actually dig out a core, a little column of the tree, and count rings without actually cutting down the tree. And that's how most living trees are dated these days. Now, we do know that there are situations under which a tree can form more than one ring a year. I think the record is 5 rings a year. But it has to be pretty unusual conditions for that to happen. Generally speaking, trees form 1 ring a year. The very, very accurate way of dating things. Well, if I look at the oldest living tree, once again, we don't have to cut down the tree to do this, we find that it has 4,790 rings. It's called Methuselah, and believe it or not, it's a state secret as to where this tree is. We know what national park it's in, but the actual location is a state secret. Because you know, if people knew, they'd be coming taking chunks out of the tree to take home, you know? So we don't let people know that, right? So the thing about this isn't a sequoia tree. It's not one of these big trees everybody thinks of. It's actually a kind of a bushy tree called a bristlecone pine. These are bristlecone pines here, and these are the oldest known trees. There's no known time limit, no known age limit for these trees. And as a matter of fact, according to the people who actually know where this tree is and examine it, this tree seems just as healthy as the young 1,000-year-old trees that are right next to it. So it's showing no signs of aging or dying of old age. And we don't know how old bristlecone pines can be because the oldest one we have seems to be pretty darn healthy right now. Now here's the thing. If you want to believe in an ancient Earth, you have to believe that bristlecone pines have been around for a couple 100 million years. And even though they've been around for a couple 100 million years, the oldest one is less than 5,000 years old. And remember, trees can form more than one ring a year, so this is actually an upper limit. This tree is probably a little younger than 4,790 years old. That's probably an upper limit. Now, if you believe in the Bible and you believe there was a worldwide flood that probably would have destroyed all the trees, that worldwide flood happened about 4,500 years ago. Given the fact that this is an upper limit, that's really consistent with the idea that there was a worldwide tree-killing flood that occurred about 4,500 years ago. Now, once again, there are lots of different ways you can try and date something, but of all the ways, counting tree rings seems to be the most reliable. And that most reliable method tells us that at least bristlecone pines haven't been here very long, even though there doesn't seem to be an age limit, at least one we know about. So, in that case, at least trees, they look really young. The Earth's magnetic field looks very young. The Reverend Carl Kelly used to talk about this all of the time. We know that the Earth has a magnetic field, makes the compass point north. We navigate it with it. Animals navigate with it. Most animals that migrate have a built-in compass in their brain so that they can get a reading of which way is north. As far as we can tell, the way salmon know which stream to go to reproduce is because they're looking at very, very small variations in the magnetic field that pinpoint the precise stream that they need to swim up. So the magnetic field is important for navigation for people. It's also important for navigation for certain animals. A few things we know is we started measuring it in earnest in the late 1800s. And since 1890, it has been decaying. We've never seen it rise, but since 1890, when we really started measuring this stuff seriously, the magnetic field of the Earth is getting weaker. During times in the past, it does seem to have reversed, because if we look at naturally magnetic things in certain volcanic rocks, we see that sometimes they're pointed one way, other times they're pointed exactly the opposite way. And the easiest way to understand that is that the magnetic field reversed. So sometimes during the past, the compass needle would point south and not north. Also, if we look at the planets around us, or in the solar system, some planets have one, some planets don't. Now, of course, since there's this really important thing called the magnetic field, scientists want to know what made it, why is it there, that sort of thing. We think we understand that part anyway. If we look in the Earth, and even though this is amazing what science can do, even though we have never been able to dig through the Earth's crust, which is the thin layer of rock that's on top of the Earth, we haven't even gotten down to the next layer of rock, which is called the mantle. And we haven't gotten to the outer core, we haven't gotten to the inner core. But when we watch how earthquake waves travel around the world, we can actually map out what's inside the world. It's truly remarkable. And anyway, we know that there's this area called the mantle, which has got a rock that's that behaves a lot like oobleck. If you've ever played with that starchy oobleck thing, it gets harder the harder you push on it. That's what the mantle behaves like. The outer core is hot liquid. The inner core is hot solid. We think that there are electric currents in the outer core. And we think there's particular types of motion that develop that cause these electric currents. And these electric currents, when they move, form a magnetic field. So the Earth is one big electromagnet, as far as we can tell. And everybody pretty much agrees on that. However, how this magnetic field came to be is a bit of a dispute, depending on who you're talking with. So there are basically two theories out there. One's based on young Earth ideas. It assumes the Earth is significantly less than 10,000 years old. It's also called the rapid decay theory, so if you look this up, it might be called the rapid decay theory. And it says these electric currents are the result of specific processes by which God made the Earth. And these specific processes are laid out in the theory. It gets a little technical, and I don't want to get bogged down in the details. But the New Testament tells us that the Earth was made of water and by water. And if you make certain assumptions about what that water was like, you end up being able to understand where these electric currents come from. So that's the young Earth view, based on Scripture. There's an old Earth view, also called the dynamo theory, that the currents in the core are the result of the motion on the Earth as it spins on its axis and other convective effects that are occurring. And once again, it's way too detailed to get bogged down in that. The key here is this. Both of these theories are very mathematical, and both of them can be used to make specific predictions about the strengths of these magnetic fields and how long they should last. All right? Now, the old Earth theory, which is what I first learned, has a lot of problems. A lot of problems. First of all, it can't even correctly predict whether or not a planet should have a magnetic field. For example, Mars has no planetary magnetic field, but the dynamo theory says it should. And the dynamo theorists don't understand why. Mercury, when we first sent a robotic spacecraft to Mercury, they almost did not put a magnetic field sensing device on it, because the dynamo theory said Mercury should not have a magnetic field. But it turns out these magnetometers are pretty cheap and pretty light, so they went ahead and put one on, and sure enough, despite the fact that the theory says it shouldn't, Mercury does have a planetary magnetic field. All of these, almost all scientific theories have sort of what I call fudge factors. They're things we don't really know really clearly, so we just kind of have to guess at them. And if we use Earth to calibrate all those guesses, so we take all the fudge factors and we make them work for Earth, then the dynamo theory doesn't work for any of the other planets' magnetic field. It's either too strong or too weak, not there, should be there. Also, we know that the Moon and Mars currently don't have magnetic fields. However, the Moon and Mars, according to rock samples, had one at one time. So they don't have them now, but they did have them at one time, at least according to certain rock samples. The dynamo theory says, look, as long as your core is liquid, you should always have a magnetic field if you had one to begin with. So there's no way the dynamo theory can account for a planet or a moon losing its magnetic field. So in short, the dynamo theory is pretty bad, right? In contrast, the young Earth theory works really, really well. Really well. For example, it correctly predicts whether or not each planet has or has not a magnetic field. It's right on every planet. Furthermore, once again, there are fudge factors involved. So if you use the Earth to fix all those fudge factors and get the theory working for Earth, then that theory is right on every other planet's magnetic field as well. What's really impressive about this is this theory was written in 1984. At that time, we did not know the magnetic fields of Neptune or Uranus. Hadn't been measured yet. But the rapid decay guy, the guy who made this model, Russell Humphrey, said, if we ever get around to measuring these values, here's what they should be. A few years later, the Voyager spacecrafts each measured one, and they were exactly what the rapid decay theory predicted. Now, to me, that's pretty amazing. And this is, in fact, what separates a scientific theory from a non-scientific theory. A lot of people have different ideas of what makes a theory scientific. From a scientist's point of view, here it is. If a theory can make a testable prediction about something that isn't known, it's scientific. And furthermore, if that prediction is then confirmed by the data, it's probably correct. Well, this theory's done it more than this, but this theory has done it at least twice. Because it made two predictions about two things that were not known. And when those things were measured, they were exactly what the theory predicted. That's pretty impressive. But it gets even better. Remember, Moon and Mars currently have no planetary magnetic fields, but rocks indicated they used to. Now, this was known about the Moon when the guy wrote the theory in 1984, but this was not known about Mars. It wasn't known until the late 90s that Mars at one time had a planetary magnetic field. So that's another prediction. It said, look, Mars should have had a planetary magnetic field at one time. Almost 15 years later, we figured out it did. And then this is the most impressive. Remember, they almost didn't put a magnetometer on the robotic spacecraft that measured, that went to Mercury because they didn't think Mercury had a magnetic field. Well, they ended up putting one on. They ended up measuring that it had a magnetic field. That was back in 1975. We sent a robotic spacecraft to Mercury. Well, we sent one back in 2008. Now, according to the dynamo theory, magnetic field should be the same. because there hasn't been enough time for any significant change to happen. According to the rapid decay theory, it should have decayed by about 6%. Guess what? When we got there in 2000, we actually didn't get there till 2010, when the robotic spacecraft got there, it had weakened. It had only weakened by 4%, not 6%, but still it had weakened, which is something the dynamo theory didn't predict at all, but the young Earth theory did. So to me, the Earth's magnetic field looks young. At least it seems to be young from the available evidence. Also, when we put the Earth and the Sun together, it looks very, very young. Because based on everything, and we haven't visited the Sun, so we can't be 100% sure, but we think we understand how the Sun works. We think we understand everything. It basically fuses lighter elements, predominantly hydrogen, into heavier elements, predominantly helium. And that's what we're trying to do these days to make clean energy. We're trying to do nuclear fusion. You may have heard in the news that another milestone was made in the nuclear fusion, and that's true. There was another milestone made. We're probably now only about 60 years out from getting fusion energy. But the sun's always been doing it as far as we can tell. It's been fusing hydrogen mostly into helium mostly, and when that fusion occurs, energy is released. Well, what's really interesting about this is sort of the opposite of a fire. If I start burning wood, the fire gets really hot, and then what does it do? It dies away as it runs out of fuel. When nuclear fusion happens and hydrogen fuses into helium, the sun actually gets more compact, which makes the fusion faster. So the sun actually gets hotter the older it is. Now, it'll eventually die out as well, but it has to get all the way up to iron, really, which is a long way away. So right now, based on what it's doing, fusing hydrogen into helium, then in the end, the sun is actually getting hotter. And with really delicate measurements, we've been able to confirm that. Very, very small changes, because we haven't been measuring it for that long. But based on the very small changes, they're consistent with the theory that in the end, the sun should be getting hotter as time goes on. Now, this is a problem, because if you play the tape backwards, what does that mean? In the past, the sun should be dimmer. Well, the sun is our source of energy. So what that means is, as we go back in the past, the Earth is getting less energy. And according to Dr. David Soderblom, who is an old earther, he says, according to standard solar models, at a billion years of age, so when the sun was only 1 billion years old, the sun had something like 75% of today's luminosity. And under those conditions, we would get the Earth freezing over, and it wouldn't recover because it would be a high albedo. What this means is, it's getting so little energy that all the water freezes. It's not warm enough to keep water liquid, so it all freezes. Ice is more reflective than water, so once you have a bunch of ice, it starts reflecting light back to the sun, so it gets even less energy. So the Earth becomes a snowball and stays a snowball forever, according to solar theories. This is called the young faint sun problem, and so in the end, the Earth would look like this when the sun was 1 billion years old. And the thing is, when the sun was 1 billion years old, that's when life was supposed to first appear. You're not going to have life appearing on a snowball. Not going to happen. So in the end, this tells us there's something wrong with this idea that the Earth and the sun have been around for 4.6 billion years old. Back in 2012, the Space Telescope Science Institute hosted a 2-day symposium about this problem. It was called The Faint Early Sun: Paradox, Problem, or Distraction. It was a 2-day event, and the conclusion was, this is a serious problem. Based on everything we know, we shouldn't be here if the Earth and Sun are really 4.6 billion years old. And that's a problem. It's a problem if we shouldn't be here, all right? There was no solution produced in this 2-day symposium, and a few proposed things were shown to be invalid. And in the end, this is still a problem. It's still a problem for anyone who wants to believe the Earth and Sun are 4.6 billion years old, because in the end, the Sun would have been too cold. The Earth would have been too cold. Life couldn't have happened, right? So once again, the Earth and the Sun, they look young. Now let's try and make it something a little more tangible than the Earth and the Sun. Those are big things that are far apart from each other. We don't know very much about the Sun. So what's a little more tangible? Well, I think the thing that sort of is the best icon of an old Earth is dinosaur bones, right? We all know the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. So when I get a bone from a dinosaur, it's got to be at least 65 million years old. However, what we find is if we actually analyze these bones, they look incredibly young. Incredibly young. And there are two independent lines of evidence that tell us they're incredibly young. And the first is the one that's near and dear to my heart because it's right up my alley, my specialty. There is a significant amount of radioactive carbon in dinosaur bones. And this is a serious, serious problem if you want to believe these bones are even 1 million years old, much less, or even 100,000 years old, much less 65 million years old. Why? Because carbon-14 has a pretty short half-life. When things radioactively decay, they cut themselves in half over a particular amount of time, and that time is called the half-life. So if I had, say, 100 pounds of carbon-14, and I waited 5,700 years, roughly the length of this talk, right? If I waited that long, I wouldn't have 100 pounds anymore. I'd only have 50 pounds. And if I waited another 5,700 years, I'd only have 250 pounds. Every 5,700 years, the amount of carbon-14 gets cut in half. So carbon-14 never actually goes away because it keeps cutting itself in half. However, if you cut yourself in half enough, you get to be so small that you're not detectable anymore. And our best equipment can detect carbon or any radioactive atom over a course of 10 half-lives. After 10 half-lives, pretty much any radioactive atom becomes undetectable. So, if something has carbon-14 in it, it's got to be less than 60,000 years old. That's the bottom line, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to find carbon-14 in it. Nevertheless, every dinosaur bone that has been measured has significant amounts of carbon-14 in it. Now, we haven't known this for very long. Why? Because old Earthers don't want to test dinosaur bones for carbon-14. Their excuse is, it wouldn't be worth it. We know there's nothing in there, right? But creationists are like, no, these bones are only thousands of years old. There ought to be detectable amounts of carbon-14. Well, eventually, creationists got enough money to start digging and finding fossilized dinosaur bones. So this is a young Earth creationist cutting in to a Triceratops femur. And the reason he's cutting in is you want to look for the carbon-14 inside the bone. All sorts of crazy things happen on the outside of the bone. You got to get inside the bone to look for what's really there. So he's cutting into that bone so he can extract some samples and get them tested for carbon-14. So they've done this for 8 different sets of dinosaur fossils, multiple samples from each set. In every sample, a significant amount of carbon-14 has been found. In fact, the least amount of carbon-14 indicated that the fossil was only 39,000 years old. Now, I don't think that number's right, but my point is this. If that bone was 65 million years old, there should be absolutely no carbon-14 in it. So when you ask, what's the carbon date, the carbon-14 date, the answer should be, we can't tell, because we can't detect any. Every one of these dinosaur fossils had enough carbon-14 in it to detect and date it. And all of them dated at 39,000 years or younger. Now, like I said, I don't think that value is right, but what it tells me is they can't be millions of years old, because the carbon-14 would be gone, and it's not. Now, this is a really important point, because after all, we've been being told for years, don't test these dinosaur bones for carbon-14. There's not going to be any in them. Okay, now there's carbon-14 in them. We know that. So what do evolutionists do about it? Well, they stopped testing the dinosaur bones. Because you see, these young Earth creationists, they had enough money to dig for fossils and sample them and send them out, but they didn't have enough money to buy a particle accelerator, which is what you need to do this carbon-14 testing. So what you do is you take your samples and you send it to a carbon-14 testing lab. This lab makes its money by you sending them samples and paying them, right? When the lab read the scientific publication that these young Earth creationists wrote, here's what they said in response. The scientists at CAIS, that's the facility that actually does the carbon-14 testing, and I are dismayed by the claims that you and your team have made with respect to the age of the Earth and the validity of biological evolution. Consequently, we are no longer able to provide radiocarbon services in support of your anti-scientific agenda. Think about what these guys are saying. First of all, they're willing to give up money because this is how they make their living. But they're willing to give up money in this case because they don't want these data out there. But more importantly, they're calling the young Earth creationists anti-scientific. Let me ask you a question. What's more anti-scientific? Wanting to do carbon-14 testing or refusing to do carbon-14 testing? Because even if you want to believe these fossils are 65 million years old, and I've got lots of colleagues who want to believe that, if you want to believe it, you better figure out why there's radiocarbon in there. You better figure out why there's carbon-14 in there. So you ought to be doing even more tests. You should be more interested. Someone who believes these are 65 million years old, they should be more interested in these tests than someone who doesn't. Because you got to do a lot of tests to figure out why something that shouldn't be in there is actually in there. But they're just stopping. That's it. You'll see in a moment this is not all that uncommon. Okay, speaking of dinosaur fossils, here's the second line of evidence that indicates they're very, very young. There are lots of examples of soft tissue found in dinosaur fossils. The first one was found in 2005. It was discovered by accident. No one was looking for it, of course, because soft tissue shouldn't be in 65 million year old bones. But nevertheless, Mary Schweitzer found in a Tyrannosaurus rex femur that was supposed to be 65 million years old, clearly soft tissue. The soft tissue was so soft it was actually elastic, because she said if you grab this with forceps, you grab this with forceps and pull, this stretches, and when you release, it comes right back. And this is in a dinosaur bone that's supposed to be 65 million years old, right? Now, if this is some one-off thing, that's not a big deal. However, laboratory studies do say that soft tissue generally decays in about 50 weeks. Even the molecules that make them up, we have pretty good models of how these molecules behave. The models tell us that after 30,000 years into it, these molecules should have fallen apart. So this myosin and myoglobin, particularly those proteins, have a lifetime of 30,000 years. So even under the best of conditions, this stuff ought to go away in 30,000 years. But nevertheless, it's there in the dinosaur bones. And once again, you might think, this is a one-off. But in order to try and figure things out, the guy who owns the museum that this fossil belongs to is Jack Horner. I don't know if you know him. He's sort of a famous guy. Some people say that the Harrison Ford guy, Indiana Jones, was modeled after Jack Horner because he did some sort of crazy things to get his samples. So anyway, he's a pretty famous paleontologist. A creationist group offered him $10,000 to have that tissue carbon dated. Because once again, shouldn't be any carbon-14 in there if it's 65 million years old. But if it's young, there ought to be carbon-14 in there. They were going to give his museum $10,000 just to be allowed to have that sample to test. And he specifically said he wouldn't do it because the spin that creationists can get off us is not going to help us. If you actually go to YouTube and just search Jack Horner and then, what's the guy's name from KGov? KGov would be good enough, KGOV. They actually have a recording of the conversation that goes on between them. It's really quite incredible. Quite incredible. And this $10,000 was above and beyond the amount required to do the carbon-14 dating. So the museum was going to get $10,000, was going to get a few other artifacts dated, and Jack Horner said, no, because he didn't like the spin that we could get off of it. All right? Once again, old earthers refusing to do scientific tests, that happens a lot. It happens quite a bit. All right? Since then, lots of examples have been found. Lots and lots. The one I want to focus on, here's another one, supposed to be 65 million years old. It's a Triceratops horn. This is a full Triceratops skull. What they found was just one of the horns. They soaked the horn in weak acid. The weak acid will attack the minerals, but it won't attack anything organic. So it won't attack any tissue. It'll just attack the minerals that make up the bone. And after a month or so, soft strips of brown tissue were recovered, and they were flexible. If you've ever seen the documentary, Is Genesis History? One of the scenes in there is the guy actually stretching the tissue that was pulled from the Triceratops horn. It's an interesting documentary. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's a really interesting documentary, and that scene alone is worth seeing it. He actually takes that 65 million year old tissue and just stretches it and lets it relax again. Really quite incredible. Well, anyway, this tissue could be anything, so they decided to look at it under an electron microscope. An electron microscope allows you to get really, really big, and here's what they saw. Now, if you didn't take high school biology for quite a while, you might not recognize these. These are bone cells. Bone cells have a very specific characteristic. They're ovals, they're longer than they are, so they're not circles, they're ovals. But more importantly, they have these little extensions. We call them filopodial extensions. And these extensions actually allow the bone cells to communicate with one another so that they can adjust to the body's needs. And so when they looked at this stuff under the microscope, they found these bone cells, which is exactly what you'd expect to find in bone tissue. Now these cells are dead, but they are not fossilized in any way. In the peer-reviewed publication that this was published in, the author said this: filopodial extensions, these little guys, were delicate and showed no evidence of any permineralization or crystallization artifact, and therefore were interpreted to be soft. So these are dead cells that haven't fossilized, yet haven't decayed. And if you want to believe this is 65 million years old, you got to figure out a way to keep those cells dead but not decaying for 65 million years. And please understand, that little black bar there, that tells you the scale. The length of that black bar is 20 millionths of a meter. Each one of these little filopodial extensions is significantly less than a millionth of a meter wide, and yet hasn't decayed away and hasn't fossilized. I don't see how that could happen in 65 million years. I can see how it happened in a few thousand years, not 65 million years. That horn, the rest of the part of it that was soft tissue, was carbon dated. And once again, there was enough carbon-14 in it to show that it was probably 41,000 years old. Now, once again, I don't think carbon-14 dating works either, but if it was 65 million years old, they shouldn't have been able to get this number at all, because there shouldn't have been any carbon-14 there at all. Now, how did evolutionists respond to this incredible thing? Well, the university fired him. Once he published his paper, the principal investigator, Mark Armitage, was fired from his university position. In fact, in the lawsuit that followed, it was stated that after the paper was published, a university official stormed into his office and shouted, "We are not going to tolerate your religion in this department." That's probably what caused the university to settle out of court. Was that statement there. Now, I've actually talked to Mark Armitage, very interesting fellow. He is a wizard with a microscope. Microscopy sometimes has to become an art in order to be really good, and he is a true artist when it comes to microscopes. And anyway, he said it wasn't the paper that got him fired. The paper was okay. They were willing to have somebody who said soft dinosaur cells. However, when the paper was published, students found out that their microscope lab had soft dinosaur cells. So he said regularly, every day, there'd be 4 or 5 students come down and want to see the dinosaur cells. Because it is cool, right? It's cool to have dinosaur cells. And he said the biology department got so furious that these students were interested in the soft dinosaur cells. That's what got him fired. And once he was fired, there was no one to show these kids the soft dinosaur cells anymore. And he said that's probably what got him fired. Anyway, the settlement was done out of court and so forth, so we don't know how much was settled, but he was able to use the money from the settlement to continue his research. And since then, he's done some incredible things. So for example, in this picture here, in this scanning electron microscope picture, the cells are still attached to the bone. They're still there, part of the bone. Since then, he's actually been able to pull them out. And so this here is a single triceratops cell, single triceratops bone cell just floating in water now. And his website is the Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute. He has a video of him grabbing cell with microforceps and just flipping it back and forth, and you just see it flopping around because it really is soft. So he's isolated several individual cells. What's cool about that is, you know what that is right there? Right there, that little dark circle? That's the cell's nucleus. You know what's in the nucleus, don't you? DNA. Now, it takes a lot of DNA for us to be able to analyze it. So a single cell is not enough. But the hope is you get enough cells, you get enough DNA, you can actually start analyzing the dinosaur DNA. That would be pretty darn cool. But he's also found other stuff, too. He's found the portions of nerve cells. Nerve cells can be really long. There's a cell body, and then there's a long strip of cell that goes to the next nerve cell. It's called the axon. That axon is just part of the cell. These axons are wrapped in a fatty fiber called the myelin sheath, and that's what this is. This looks like it could be a lot of things, but to anybody who knows anatomy, these little markings here show that this is something that's being wrapped in a fatty tissue. And it's exactly the right size and everything to be a nerve axon. So this is a nerve axon from a dinosaur. And once again, it's still soft. Here's the most amazing thing, though. This is a blood vessel. These are the red blood cells in the blood of the dinosaur. Once again, not fossilized, not decayed. Truly incredible. And it's not surprising that it's a young Earth creationist that's doing this, because in the end, we're the ones who are really inquisitive about these dinosaur fossils. The old Earthers want to stop the tests. The young Earthers want to do more. We've done more. We've seen a lot of cool stuff. So anyway, he's still doing stuff. Like I said, he has a website called the Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute. Very, very interesting. All right, so why does this scientist believe in a young Earth? Really, most of Earth's features are best understood if they're only thousands of years old. The Earth really does look young. And really, when I look at nature, I generally see things that are best understood as having been around for a few thousand years, not much more than that. It's the safest view for a careful scientist. If there were no data on either side, a scientist would have to be a young Earther because that involves no bad extrapolation, right? Old Earthers require huge extrapolations, which are not careful science. So it's the safest view for a careful scientist. And there are some things, and in the question and answer session, if you want, I can give you some. There are some evidences that make the Earth look old, but these are generally contradictory, and they're generally about things we don't understand very well. So some aspects of radioactivity make the Earth look really old, but we don't understand radioactivity very well. It's still throwing us surprises. So most likely, the reason it makes the Earth look old is we don't understand it very well. But the fact is, the vast majority of the stuff I see in nature is most consistent with the Earth being thousands of years old. Okay, that's all I've got.